is originally from Minneapolis, I think.
St. Paul.
St. Paul.
St. Paul.
Oh, my God. Okay. Twin Cities.
There you go.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were on that side of St. Paul. And went to college, Lewis and Clark in Portland. So, like Allie, has a bi-coastal understanding of the American landscape. And Charles is writing his dissertation on the history of business response to issues of pollution and governmental regulation from the 1950s through to the current regulatory regime. The title is Managed Protection, American Industry, Governmental Regulation, and the Price of the Environment. And at issue there is the whole question of how what is now called free market environmentalism developed as an approach, for example, emissions rights being treated as properties, as an approach to solving environmental problems. Today he's going to talk to us about toxic landscaping.
Okay, as Betsy said, my lecture today is on the making of the American toxic landscape, a 20th century story with three interconnected dimensions. I'll describe the development of the toxic landscape first as the material and imaginary consequence of the Cold War, second as the byproducts of industrial production or capitalism, and finally as a key animating concept in the environmentalist and environmental justice movements. But before I begin, a word on the terminology I'll use today. The word toxic has been used since the middle of the 17th century to describe things of a poisonous nature. Toxic was first attached to waste, either human or industrial, in the 1920s, giving us our word for refuse that is somehow malignant. Appending toxic to landscape, we get a poisoned space, which in itself is a familiar concept. As Andrews described in our earlier reading this semester, the workspace of 19th century coal mines often contained fatal concentrations of carbon monoxide and other gases, and workers were aware of those perilous dangers every time they descended into the mines. But whereas that threat subsided when those miners returned to the surface, the development of a mass industrial society in the 20th century created new, seemingly ubiquitous dangers. Those perils and the perceptions that they were inescapable produced the toxic landscape in the 20th century. With the detonation of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the U.S. entered the nuclear age. Despite the horrific nature of those bombings, public enthusiasm swelled for this new technology, and the general public celebrated new testing programs in the American Southwest and in the South Pacific. American allies shared that enthusiasm, and French designers of a new swimsuit even went so far as to take the name for that new two-piece bathing suit from the tests in Bikini Atoll in the late 1940s. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic weapon, shattering that sense of complacent enthusiasm. As the US and the Soviet Union rapidly moved to develop and test and deploy more sophisticated bombs, depositing them in strategic locations across the world, that apocalyptic imagery of nuclear weaponry quickly became the most salient motif of an escalating Cold War. So just to get a sense of what you guys know about the extent of this testing, does anyone know roughly how many atomic weapons were detonated by 1955? Yeah?
It's in the thousands, wasn't it?
Not by 1950. See, this is the problem with asking a question like this, because now it'll look like the extent is less. No, not in the thousands. It's something like 2,000, like over all of the testing. So by 1955, 70 atomic weapons have been detonated. So not quite the thousands, but still an enormous scale of testing. By the end of the 1950s, by 1960, over 300 weapons had been detonated. And then obviously, since we're at somewhere about 2000 today, it's accelerated from there. But there were an enormous number of these tests, and in the case of this test, you can see this was a test to see what a submerged bomb would do to a naval fleet. So they used Japanese and American ships, and British ones as well, I believe, and positioned them around and then detonated this massive bomb. And it turns out that underwater bombs are not friendly to ships, so experiment confirmed. But in the 1940s, this terrible potency of this nuclear weaponry was initially understood to extend only to the immediate victims of a detonation. Radioactive fallout and radiation poisoning were poorly understood, although scientists who studied test subjects, soldiers and other test subjects, were beginning to observe some alarming trends. Researchers at the Atomic Energy Commission, for instance, recognized that the radioactive isotope strontium-90 potentially posed an acute threat to public health because of its chemical similarity to calcium. That is, deposited in the soil as a result of tests, strontium-90 or SR90 would be taken up by plants, which in turn would be eaten by herbivores and then by humans, all the while the SR90 concentrating often in the human bones. But yet the Atomic Energy Commission and other governmental agencies continuously reassured the public that fallout was not dangerous, in fact, rejecting claims such as those brought by a Utah rancher and his wife that radioactive testing or weapons testing in Nevada had deposited dust that had caused their hair to fall out and their skin and fingernails to peel off. Yet public skepticism continued to grow, and unforeseen consequences of testing in the Pacific soon belied that official denial of harm. So, in 1954, researchers on the Bravo test, which was the first test of the U.S.'s more powerful hydrogen bomb, misjudged a weather report and thus exposed some 28 Americans and 236 residents of the Marshall Islands to extensive fallout. Though these Americans and these residents of the Marshall Islands were quickly decontaminated, the crew of a fishing boat, a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, were not so fortunate. Downwind of the test, the crew experienced 4 hours of a strange white snow, from which they suffered acute radiation poisoning, soon becoming very ill, and as they struggled to make their way back to Japan, their hair began to fall out. On their return, Japanese scientists confirmed the presence of SR90 in the snow, that fallout that had accumulated on the Lucky Dragon. Further research in 1955 and 1956 revealed that SR90, dispensed over by this point a decade's worth of testing, had found its way into all humans, regardless of their position in the world or their age. This wide dissemination of SR90, this ubiquitous dissemination, shattered any assumption that the toxicity of the nuclear age was confined to those unlucky enough to share an immediate landscape with the test. That ubiquity provoked outrage as well as resignation. As Newsweek proclaimed in 1956, the testing of hydrogen bombs may have already propelled enough strontium-90 into the atmosphere to doom countless of the world's children to inescapable and incurable cancer. Americans, regardless of their wealth or privilege, could no longer imagine themselves immune. And that shattered sense of immunity produced what the social psychologist Ulrich Beck calls a risk society, with its members united in their collective anxiety about their inability to calculate the lethality of modern life, even with the help of science. Of course, lethal pollution, as we've discussed, was in itself nothing new. In just one example that you'll be familiar with, the particulate matter produced by the expansion of coal burning factories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries formed an acute threat to public health in industrializing areas. But those threats were generally avoidable by those with the means to repair to country houses or to at least live upwind of the factories. By contrast, the threat of SR90 and other nuclear toxins was inescapable, according to that research in the mid-1950s, following humans to the far corners of the globe. Yet as we observe how that resulting collective anxiety manifested itself in the landscape, we could also see a countervailing trend that continued to differentiate between different groups of people based on different levels of exposure to threats. The Lucky Dragon became a potent symbol of nuclear dangers, but the physical suffering was confined to the residents, or was confined to that crew. The ability to project the risks of toxicity onto distant foreign lands and their peoples is an important feature of the American toxic landscape, and one we'll return to throughout this lecture. In an escalating Cold War in the 1960s, President Kennedy's administration developed a public shelter system in which to house the residents of the nation in the event of a nuclear attack. The Civil Defense Administration designated nearly 1 million public shelters in basements and interior spaces across the country, marking them with this sign that I think most of you will recognize, and stocking them with canned water, canned food, and medicine. So you can see here, FEMA, which was actually formed, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, was formed to coordinate the public response to a nuclear attack. And you can see this nice FEMA display here informing you what you would be equipped with when you arrive in your shelter. Now, the administration also encouraged Americans to construct fallout shelters in which, so this is first just some examples of these signs across the landscape, all, from Nashville to Goldsboro to here on 124th Street. I actually took this weekend, and I liked it for its sort of apocalyptic lighting and imagery. Now, in addition to constructing those public shelters, the Kennedy administration also encouraged Americans to construct private fallout shelters in which they might wait out the worst of contamination in their homes. In 1961, the Defense Department distributed some 25 million copies of a brochure promoting these home shelters. American businesses had offered private shelters for at least a decade, but with this official encouragement, they scaled up production. And shelters became part of this suburban culture of affluence. So you can see here a offering, the kitty cocoon, or the kid cocoon, which came fully stocked and installed in your yard for $3,000. And because this is America, we want to be able to differentiate even within the shelter community. And so a luxury model was only $500 extra. I'm not sure exactly what the luxury model had in it, if you got more canned food or canned champagne or something. But anyways, Sears, Roebuck & Co. offered these kits, and even a Manhattan dress shop, so a real retailer that had nothing to do with the production of shelters, got into the spirit, offering an outfit of gay slacks and dress with a cape that could double as an extra blanket. So you had something to wear in the shelter. Now, not everyone expected to wait out the shelter. Oh, sorry, one more thing. So this was, to me, like the greatest example of this penetration of shelters into American life. So here you have a dollhouse sold by the Marks Toy Company, with the usual features of a dollhouse, a kitchen, a living room, etc., but also with its own shelter. So your dolls, could wait down here and use their calendar to mark their time underground. Now, not everyone expected to wait out a nuclear war underground, with some following the lead of Princeton aeronautics professor Marcus Knowlton and his stockbroker wife Mary to islands like Culebra in Puerto Rico, which they had calculated based on oceanic and atmospheric circulation to be uniquely situated in the Western Hemisphere to avoid the worst of a nuclear attack. Within a few years, this sort of mania around shelter construction had subsided, with critics pointing out that, with the exception of those lucky enough to escape to an island, the shelters that you would put in your yard probably wouldn't help you very much in the event of a direct attack. But while the American public was perhaps resigned to their inability to protect themselves from a direct attack, they remained more proactive about the threat posed by nuclear testing. Organizations like the Greater St. Louis Citizens Committee for Nuclear Information published information and supported research on radioactive toxins. This committee conducted a consumer campaign that collected over 160,000 baby teeth to track the growing concentration of SR90 in the human body. Fanned by such efforts, public opposition contributed to the 1963 agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to ban above-ground weapons testing. But by this point, public fears over SR90 and other toxins had been joined by far more expansive concerns over pesticides like DDT used by American agribusiness, as well as synthetic compounds like PCBs that industrial manufacturers released into the air and water. Marvels of human ingenuity to rival the splitting of the atom, synthetic pesticides and fertilizer helped American agribusiness fuel what historians call the Green Revolution in the first half of the 20th century. scaling up crop production, vaulting it far ahead of what it had been a half century before. So I include this slide as an example of what we've talked about in this class of this public funding of private ventures. So the Rocky Mountain Arsenal was a U.S. Army site in which munitions were developed and chemical gases, including mustard and nerve gas. Following the war, with this already polluted site and with this industrial infrastructure built up, the Army handed it over to Shell Corporation, Shell Chemical, and Shell used this site to manufacture pesticides. One of the, sort of as an aside, one of the fascinating turns in the last 20 years has been the rehabilitation of many of these sites as wildlife refuges, and you'll hear this in the MASPA. We read this in the MASPA reading. But what the Rocky Mountain Arsenal has done is to pitch itself to local schools as a place where children can come to observe a native Colorado grassland. And they even sell a coloring book that you can buy from the site. So pesticides were critical. Pesticides generated by plants like the shell plant were critical to the new practice of no-till agriculture, in which the soil erosion of the soils that had produced the Dust Bowl in the 1930s could be mitigated. But the application of pesticides was imprecise, especially in the preferred method of aerial spraying. And some biologists began to express concern that the lethal dangers of pesticides might not be confined to the weeds and insects they were designed to control. In parallel fashion to the Atomic Energy Commission's denial of nuclear toxicity, the Department of Agriculture squelched such opposition during the early 1950s, while assuring the public that pesticides pose no dangers to their health. Nevertheless, in response to public pressure, the Food and Drug Administration began to regulate pesticides above a certain threshold in the late 1950s in consumer food, though determining that threshold proved quite contentious, with consumer advocacy groups lined up against pesticide manufacturers and agribusinesses. The FDA recall of all New Jersey cranberries for having too much residue of the weed killer aminotriazole just before Thanksgiving in 1959 was taken up by opponents of regulation as the cranberry scare. So they like to portray people who were supporting these regulations as hysterical. Despite these efforts to belittle critics, public concern continued to grow in the 1960s as more research pointed to the dangers of pesticides. So alongside pesticides, tremendous advances in chemical engineering in the first half of the 20th century produced synthetic chemicals with new, very attractive properties. For instance, polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, became widely popular as insulating and cooling fluids in the first half of the 20th century because of their stable chemical structure, especially their failure to oxidize in reaction to air, and their insolubility in water. Among other applications, PCBs provided the fuel inside all those transformers and capacitors that you'll remember from the Nye reading, this vast expansion of the electric industry. So the outboard Marine Corps in Waukegan, Illinois, produced the Johnson motor that many of you might be familiar with if you've spent any time around little boats. And outboard Marine Corps used some 9 million pounds of PCBs in its aluminum die-cast machines over 7 years of production. And many of these made their way into Lake Michigan, which today continues to have a PCB concentration in this area higher than the FDA limits on what sort of fish are safe to eat. Now, while proving enormously useful in the expansion of modern industrial society, synthetic chemicals also had an adverse effect on the health of humans and other organisms. PCBs, for example, provoked intense rashes when they came in contact with human skin. And they are linked to liver poisoning and damage to other internal organs, as well as depressed immune systems. What's more, that resistance to degradation that made PCBs so attractive in their industrial application made their danger that much greater, since once they were inside the body, they tended not to break down. And while PCBs are insoluble in water, they are soluble in fat, as you'll read in the Nancy Langston reading, and they often concentrate in areas with high fat, such as breasts and in the uterus and other areas in which you presumably would not want these sort of chemicals. Now, in 1962, many of you will recognize the biologist pictured here. In 1962, in the midst of this growing concern about industrial chemicals, the biologist Rachel Carson published the book that